Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. And so we have a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. So we're very honored today. Listen, normally I'm very intimidated by people who are on the show who are smarter than me. But today I have a double whammy, somebody who's smarter than me and who's better looking than me. So I don't know how to handle that. So we'll have to figure that one out. Mykola, how are you today?
Good, thanks for inviting me. Pleasure seeing you, and thank you for your charming words as always.
Well, listen, it's a pleasure. But okay, let's just jump into this. By the way, just so everyone knows, Mykola is from Ukraine, and where you're from, Vinnytsia, right? That's where you're from?
So I lived in Vinnytsia for 2 years. I was born in Chernivtsi, and I also lived in Kiev. So I experienced all parts of Ukraine, if I may say.
Well, excellent, because we need to talk about the entire country. So, okay, so here's the first question to you. Donald Trump, hero President Trump, said he was going to end the war in a day. Well, it is 70 days, 5 days now, and the war hasn't ended. So give me your take on what's currently happening with the war and the discussions about possible peace.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think he didn't specify what day is going to be. He'll definitely finish it probably within a day, but it's going to be within, I don't know, 6, 7 months, maybe a year, maybe two. But he didn't specify. And I think that's a quite important and prolific moment that we should be talking about, is that unfortunately the missile attacks, they continue to exist. So just yesterday we had four, or actually I think it was around 8 missiles that hit Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine. And my mom, she's still there. So, and unfortunately it hit even the district where I used to study. So the war is still going on. There is nothing about that, the ceasefire agreement that we were talking about even a few weeks ago, that Russia will at least stop attacking Ukraine with the missiles in the peaceful cities. It's no longer the case. Not only that, but the Black Sea initiative that everybody was talking about, that the Russians will not use the sea for launching its attacks. It seems that Russia again abuses this rule, and they're launching their missiles from the Black Sea. And I think that's important to understand, that it's the only way for Ukraine to win. It's basically to protect its own sovereignty, is to actually win Russia on the battleground. And so far, the US is not striking the deal, is not actually helping Ukraine as it could to finish the war. And I'm just unfortunately saddened to see this.
Well, as a Ukrainian, how do you feel? Okay, let's talk about specifics of a peace deal, or as a Ukrainian, would you be okay if Ukraine and President Zelensky had to agree to give up land, to give up territory? Would you be satisfied with that?
No, and the majority of Ukrainians, according to the polls, they're not happy with it either. First of all, it raises the question of the sacrifice. A lot of Ukrainians lost their family members, and it just begs the question, why did we fight for 2.5 years if we could just concede the territory at the first place? It's the first question. The second question, it relates to our overall sovereignty. If we concede some of the territory, it again appeases Putin and gives him a green light to attack or invade Ukraine in 2, 3, 4. I don't know how many years it's going to take, but we already had a precedent. We had a precedent with Ukraine in 2014. We had the case with Georgia 2 times. We had Chechnya. How many wars do we need to understand that Putin will not stop there?
But okay, but what is the magic formula here? I mean, listen, as you know, I deal with people in Ukraine every day and talk to them and advise them. And I listen. Number one, one of my most important things in life is the protection of territorial integrity. That once a country loses their territorial integrity and the world embraces that, then the world as we know it is shot. But how do you actually deal with that? I mean, I've been on the front lines. It's a hard war. It's a nasty war. So how do you actually get Russia out of Ukraine?
I think there are quite a few steps that could be done. Funnily enough, obviously we know about the tariffs, but they pushed the oil down. And this is the key part. Actually, it's going to be very difficult to win Russia because of the population and because of the masses they are happy to send to Ukraine. So the question begs, whether we should use economic power. And in this regard is the oil price, because the whole war machine of Russia is actually based on oil and the obviously rare earths that they can either sell to China, India, and other places. So I would start there. The second question is related to the sanctions. It seems that the sanctions that everybody was talking about, they used to be effective, but Russia is adjusting, and they're using cryptocurrencies, and they're using other ways of dealing with other countries. And it's quite important to keep the pressure on. It's quite important to deal with the oil fleet. It's quite important to deal with, multiple variants that we should be using here. And the third occasion, I think it's quite important to support Ukrainian army and Ukraine overall. Right now, we've seen, two successful counteroffensive, one in Kursk, one that happened in Kherson, and we know that Ukraine can repeat those examples again. We just need to give enough power to them.
But who's going to give that power? I mean, here's the thing: with America potentially pulling back, we know. I mean, that's not potentially pulling back. America is pulling back. So how do you militarily? I mean, I understand the whole economics aspect of it. I do. You strangle, you strangle the snake at the neck, and in theory you can win. But that's kind of a long-term strategy. And the reality that as long as China's there propping them up, that's going to be a bit of a difficult situation. But what if America pulls back more than they are? Can Ukraine win the war?
So I will actually slightly shift your question and say that Ukraine already won the war, because everybody was saying that Ukraine lost the war and it will cease to exist within 3 days. And here we are. Ukraine is still resisting to this day, and it's actually not losing the ground that everybody was talking about when the US would pull out. That's the first case. The second thing that we have to talk about is actually related to Europe. And I think actually the position of the US that they're pulling out, it actually unified Europe in a sense. It gave them the identity. There was a crisis in terms of a NATO, what's going to be happening to it, and now it seems that Europe finally understands that they should spend their money on defending themselves. And the third thing I wanted to raise is that essentially, in order to help Ukraine, we need to find the alternatives of the US companies that were supplying to weapons to Ukraine. Not only that, but it actually, in the long run, it will help Europe to become more independent of the US. And now we're talking specifically of the military companies. Right. So, for example, when we're talking about the connection or communications and internet, we're talking about Starlink. Right now, and actually I'm writing the paper on this with David Kirichenko, very famous Ukrainian journalist, and the US-Ukrainian journalist, we are actually finding the alternatives. And so far, there seems to be really none to the communications on the battlefield. And that's a pressing issue that we should be focusing right now. If we're talking about other companies, well, we've seen that there are artillery shells. And if we're talking about the tanks, there is a coalition of Europe. And if, France, UK, Germany, they actually start supplying Ukraine with everything what it needs, probably Ukraine can take its land back and finish the war earlier than we expect.
Okay, well, let's talk about Starlink specifically here. For a lot of people don't understand the importance of Starlink, which is Elon Musk, for those who don't know. If Ukraine starts to really not want to follow what President Trump says, what would be the impact of Starlink if Elon Musk were to pull Starlink out of Ukraine?
It's quite frankly, it's horrible. There is only one company in Europe that actually can provide the connection to Ukraine, but it's more expensive. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's Theos, and it's a UK-French company that actually can supply. At the moment, they have around 500 satellites in the space, and they're actually not planning to send more satellites at this point to the space. And I think it's quite important to understand that the communications is actually one of the main advantages the Ukraine has over Russia. One of the reasons why the counteroffensive was successful is because Ukrainians could communicate with each other quite quickly. They are autonomous units. And frankly, the Russian machine that is incredibly big, but, failures to communicate with each other allows Ukrainians to squeeze through and try to find the weak points in the enemy. Without it, it means that Ukraine will not be able to, conduct a good counteroffensive. But it raises the question whether Ukraine will be able to hold the ground, right? Because essentially Russians will be able to intercept the communications between Ukrainians. It means the Ukrainians will not be able to send their allies to the right moment. And it just begs the question whether Ukrainian will be able to hold the ground of what they're doing right now by themselves.
Let me go back to this other point you made where you said Ukraine has already won. Okay, I love Ukraine. I love Ukrainians, and it's important for people to understand that the world really thought that within 72 hours Russia would take over the country, and that and no one was going to try and stop that. So you are correct that they won, and I will have to say the initial phase. Okay, but now we're in a much greater phase. It's 3 years later. They had the initial victory. They saved themselves. There's no doubt about it, at the expense of tens or hundreds of thousands of lives. Depends on whose math you're using there. But I have to keep going back to this question: is, you know, if you just look at the battlefield map and you just look at what's happening, and neither you or I are generals. We're not military experts, but the reality is, how do you actually, kick Russia out? Now I'm going to take that. This is what Donald Trump talks about. He talks about peace. Now, okay, we all want peace. Let's all agree we want peace. But my opinion is similar to yours, I believe, is peace at the cost of capitulation is detrimental to the world. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit? What does that capitulation mean to you, and help the audience understand what the impact of that would be?
I think I would like to ask a question for you, and basically it will be my answer, is that would the US not join the Second World War if Pearl Harbor was just given to Japanese? And it's exactly the question that everybody should ask, ourselves.
Well, of course we would not have joined. That's very relevant to where I am now, is, America would not have joined. And I would argue that the world is exactly where it was prior to World War II. America is exactly where it was prior to World War II. And I met many Americans, I love my country, but have their head in the sand when it comes to this issue. But let's just go back. Well, let me just change. Let me ask you this question. Do you think President Trump, and once again, you have every right not to answer any question I ask, do you believe President Trump is being naive when it comes to President Putin and whether he can be trusted or not?
I personally was the person who was believing that he was just naive, but it seems, and that there is evidence that Trump's team has been communicating with Putin's team more than, for longer than we were expecting. And they were in close touch since 2014 and 2016. And unfortunately, they were communicating when Trump was not in the office. He admitted it himself. So we don't really know what's going on with the agenda with Trump. He was promising that he'll put, the tariffs and sanctions on Russia. And funnily enough, just recently when the announcement was made about the tariffs, they're one of the only countries in the world that actually didn't have any extra tariffs, even though the export from Russia is still bigger than from Ukraine, is Russia. And this begs the question whether Trump is actually willing to support Ukraine. Not only that, but he promised that if the ceasefire is not whole and the peace talks are not going ahead, he'll put Russia to it will be a final straw for him, and he'll finally push Russia to the negotiation table. And it doesn't seem to be the case. So I start questioning whether he has a true intention of helping Ukraine.
Well, listen, I'm glad you brought that up, and because my next guest, we're going to be talking about tariffs, so it's really relevant. I mean, it is interesting, I will say, that the only country that he did not impose tariffs on his Liberation Day, or whatever you called it, was Russia. And it begs the question, why? And I just don't know. Listen, I'm not a conspiracy nut. I don't want to think that there's some, that Trump is beholden to Putin in some way. I don't want to officially believe that, but we do have to look at the reality and the writing on the wall. But then let's go back to the reality. Let's say that Trump is more prone to want to help Putin. Let's just say it that way. Once again, how does this come to an end? How does Ukraine win? I mean, unless Europe, including I'm adding UK into that European context there, unless Europe comes militarily, boots on the ground, planes in the air, to fight on the front lines, can Ukraine win their land back? Can they?
I believe they can. And one of the most important things is that actually, if we're talking about the military boots on the ground, we're talking about the coalition of the willing, and specifically, France, UK, and Germany. And I mean, there were discussions about Italy, but it seems that Meloni is not happy to put the boots on the ground until the war is over, which begs the question, why would you put the boots on the ground? But it actually, if there were boots on the ground and they were placed not even to the front line, but they were placed in central part of Ukraine and the western part of Ukraine, mind the fact that Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe, it will actually free up the forces that are holding, let's say, the lines on the northern part and the other territories in case if Russia wants to do another counteroffensive, and actually free up the soldiers that could be used to take the territories back. But it's not just about the people, it's also about the technology. And I mean, we talked about the negative sides and we talked about what Ukraine lacked, But let's remember that actually Ukraine is number one right now in terms of the production of the drones. So the capacity, just over the last year, they produced more than 1.5 million drones. And those drones are improving. We're talking about not only guided by artificial intelligence, but we're talking about the drones that actually trace the soldiers on the other side. They can be used to geolocate the crucial points that Ukraine should strike, etc. And it shows you that if you give the capabilities for Ukrainians to develop either own systems, they will be able to take their country back. If it's not the case, at least give the weapons to Ukraine. And if it's not the case that you're not going to give the weapons to Ukraine, unfortunately, Ukraine will not be left by itself, and I'm sure that the allies will still help, at least financially, and Ukraine will develop its own capabilities. But it's a question of time. So in the end, just responding to your question, I think Ukraine will take its land back. It's a question of time, whether it's going to do it diplomatically over the course of the next decade or two, when it's going to be negotiating table with Russia, or it's going to take it militarily. And it's going to be a question whether Europe will join Ukraine or not.
Well, let's just I was actually in Ukraine when Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, was there, and he met with Zelensky, and Yermak, his chief of staff, said they told him specifically they needed drones. So Eric wrote him I don't know how large of a check, but he made sure that he provided funding to Ukraine for that drone program, and drones have made the difference. There's no doubt about it. But once again, I don't know. I mean, I think that if we don't do everything we can to defeat Ukraine, and if we don't we collectively as the world, do everything we can do to ensure territorial integrity is protected, we will end up in World War III. World War III is coming. Now, I don't want to be some crazy man and people think, oh, Dane's the boogeyman or whatever. But the reality is, as we said earlier, we are exactly where we were prior to World War II. And that needs to be remembered, is that the bad people out there, Putin, President Xi, Iran, North Korea, Hezbollah, whoever it is, the bad people have a free rein these days at the absence of America. As much as I love Europe, they just don't have the ability to really counter them like they can without American input. So listen, let's talk real quick about politics in Ukraine. Elections. Do you think they're, I advocated last year, just so you know, for the record, that there should be elections, even though they be difficult. But Ukraine's fighting for democracy. You need to show that democracy is still viable. Do you think there should be elections in Ukraine?
Personally, again, coming back to the historical parallels, there were no elections in the UK when the Second World War was in, and right now, actually, if the UK was bombed only by Germany at that time, Ukraine is actually bombed or attacked by 3 or 4 countries. So we have North Korean troops that are attacking Ukraine from the Kharkiv direction. We have, Iranian drones striking Ukraine. We are talking about Russia sending the missiles. It's only the Chinese who are giving the parts right now. We don't have the forces. So it's just going to be difficult to organize those. Now, there is a political, specifically, aspect that nobody actually raises. When we do those elections, how are we going to take the votes from the places like Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, and southern part of Ukraine? Because Ukraine still doesn't recognize that those territories were sent to Russia. And in order to hear the voices of those people, how are they going to vote? Does it give the tool for Russians to manipulate the elections? Does it also, should we ask the question whether it's actually a liable model to do so? Because essentially we're using the money that could have been spent on, pushing Ukraine to win. Now, another thing that we need to also understand is that who do we have in mind in terms of our elections? Who's going to be the next president? And right now, if you look at the polls, President Zelensky is still leading all the polls. Even if his support is not as it used to be, we're still talking about 40, 50%. The closest people to him, we're going to be talking about 15, 20% max. So President Zelensky is winning, by twofold. What's the point of doing those elections, and whether it's going to be actually a viable model to do it right now?
Well, but it's not just presidential elections. There's parliamentary elections. I mean, we have, as you call it, RADA there. I mean,
Mm,
I agree. Listen, I think if there's election, Zelensky would win. There's no doubt about it. And I think his popularity definitely increased after what happened in the Oval Office with President Trump. But when it comes to the RADA, the parliament, representation is critical, is important. But I do understand and I respect the fact of security. And one thing I've advocated to people in Ukraine is that you have former prime ministers and others talking about you can't have elections because of martial law. And I've said, don't talk about martial law because most Americans and people around the world think that's something you imposed, and
mm.
that's bogus. It's about security. So if elections can't be held, it's about security. Because one thing Russia has shown is that they don't care, that they will kill anybody they want to kill. The other day they killed children in Zelensky's hometown. And so this goes back to the whole thing about peace. I don't know. As an American, I'm trying to think at some point in time, at least I'm hoping at some point in time, that Trump's going to wake up and realize that, Putin is not, he's lying. Putin is lying. Putin has never honored any international treaty he signed ever in his entire existence. And so I don't know what Trump is thinking. I don't know what those people around him are thinking. And so that must change. So anyway, back to the elections. I digress there. Um, okay, so if there were elections, let me just ask you this. Do you, and once again, you may not want to answer this question, do you think President Zelensky is doing a good job?
I think he's doing quite, a good job in terms of fundraising for Ukraine and helping Ukraine to fight for its survival. I think, and I will be honest with you, because I'm Ukrainian myself, there were a lot of questions raised about his team. Some people in his team, unfortunately, seem to be less reliable, and it's the question, whether should be fired or replaced. But it's a technical issue. It's more for Ukrainians inside Ukraine, to decide whether those people should not be given their positions. Now, President Zelensky is a war hero. He's done really a lot for Ukraine. I mean, honestly, I would say he even flourished during the war because essentially his policies and what he's been doing for Ukraine improved drastically. If we're talking about the technological advancements and specifically, the applications that be done in Ukraine, we are leading on certain fronts. If the question of Ukrainian digitalization, and it was Mikhail Fedorov who started this, even 5, 10 years ago, it was, out of reach. Now Ukraine is leading the way. In fact, the United Kingdom is copying the model for the digital services. And I think that's quite important to acknowledge too, that some of the things that Zelensky does is great. Now, obviously, we're going into the zone of a corruption and whether the corruption is still an issue. And it is the case. But I want to actually address one important thing here, and this is that Ukraine is still climbing the ranking. So it's fighting the corruption. And in the near future and potentially, within the next 5, 10 years, if Ukraine joins NATO, and in fact, sorry, I don't want to put if Ukraine will join European Union, sorry, not NATO. NATO is obviously out of reach for now, but European Union, the institutions in place, they will help to fight the corruption. Now, whether it's going to be, dealt properly during the war, that's another question. But the corruption existed even in the US and the UK during the wartime because it's just, it's the crisis time, and the corruption always flourishes during the crisis times.
And corruption is rampant everywhere in the world. I mean, it's endemic, and in some countries, and I would argue Ukraine, it's just kind of part of the fabric of society. But it does have to be dealt with.